So hello, my name is Kathryn Sanchez. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of New Mexico Center for Memory and Aging, where I focus on neuroinflammation and how those markers of inflammation can actually be used to identify Alzheimer's disease patients before they develop clinical symptoms.
How difficult was for you to start imagining yourself as a scientist from the context you come from?
Yeah, so I would say that because I do come from a rural background, that even the level of curriculum that was offered at the college level, there were actually some courses that I did not feel prepared for. And so I definitely think that was a challenge I faced in pursuing STEM and having to learn how to teach myself so that I could catch up to my peers, even as an undergraduate at New Mexico State University. And then when I attended graduate school, again, I had to really be self-motivated to teach myself a lot of concepts that my peers already knew. Mm-hmm. I come from a family of teachers, and so they are the first people to tell you how important education is and how important education was for them in being able to empower our own Latino community. On my mother's side, that was not the case, and she was able to get her high school education only by self-persistence, and that her story actually is something that taught me that what I was seeing in my father's family was not typical of most people from my community. Okay. And so because of those things, because I saw both sides of this, I think that they were both very supportive of my pursuits in STEM.
The other thing that I wanted to concentrate on is to maybe if you can talk to me about some of the most difficult challenges that you have faced in your career path as a scientist and in your current postdoctoral position.
Yeah, so in general, as a scientist, there are a lot of things to consider when thinking about how other scientists perceive you and how other people perceive you. And in particular, obviously, I am from a minoritized background, coming from a rural community, but also being a woman and being Latina. I would say that I was someone that was always more self-conscious or self-aware of how I presented myself, making sure that I presented myself in a professional manner. And also that when I was in those professional spaces, really being conscientious of the way that I spoke. And just being in spaces that were not as welcoming in general, as a scientist, being corrected more often than, for example, my peers when I would misspeak. And so I would say that is definitely something that I've thought about as my journey in science. But I will also say that now that I'm a postdoc at the University of New Mexico, that it is wonderful to be back in the community that I was raised in, back on my homeland, mi tierra. So essentially, to kind of get back to my roots and remind myself of how far I've come and where I came from.
It seems like you were talking about how you were able to navigate spaces of privilege, right?
Yeah.
And you talk a little bit about how you were aware of how you presented yourself. And can you tell me a little bit more about this and how you were able to actually navigate and be successful in a space of privilege and coming from a background that perhaps was not privileged?
Yeah. So one of the things that I want to point out is that often in these spaces of privilege, the vision of success is a very westernized idea. And so part of assimilating was dressing more professionally. It was, again, choosing the words choosing my words carefully when I spoke, but also practicing my speaking a lot more maybe than my peers maybe felt they had to do or did. And so that's primarily how I would navigate the space of privilege.
Did this process of assimilation that you mentioned, did they have a cost on you? Like that pressure to try to fit into an environment? How have you managed that, and what are your thoughts on that, you know?
Yeah, so I would say that assimilating has made me lose part of my culture in the sense that linguistically I was not taught Spanish in order to assimilate. I guess there's been more of an intergenerational assimilation, and I guess in that aspect it's impacted me. In terms of assimilating in a place of privilege, I would say that maybe I was facing something called stereotype threat, where I was more worried about how people perceived me than maybe my peers that came from more privileged backgrounds. They didn't have to navigate those perceptions of others in the same way. That probably meant that I spent more time than necessary compared to them on the way that I presented myself.
And let's talk about, you know, some of the challenges that you have faced currently in your position and how you have been able to navigate them. You're right, institutional challenges, being a woman of color, perhaps, of navigating the science space from this positionality, perhaps, or in the strategies that you have used to succeed.
Yeah, so I think in general, there is a culture in science of self-promotion. And I feel that because, again, the way that I'm perceived or the way that society perceives women of color to not be of as much value, you kind of have this weird cognitive opposition where on one hand you have to promote yourself because that is how you get further in science. On the other hand, you are told by society that you are not worth as much necessarily, so therefore you have to be humble. And so I think that those two things being at odds was a really strange place to be. And I think that while I was navigating these spaces, that it made me less likely to speak in general. So that is one challenge that I faced in terms of career advancement in science. I have experienced microaggressions. This idea that I am a certain way because of my background, because I am Latina, because I'm a woman, I think played a role in those experiences. One way that I have overcome this idea of stereotype threat and facing microaggressions was looking at it more as an opportunity. And I know that this often depends on the space that you're in and the power dynamics that you are facing. But oftentimes, if it was a microaggression by someone that was a peer, I would actually look at it as an opportunity to educate and to explain why what they were saying was something that they would not tell a person of other privileges and have them reflect on that. And I think that contributing in that small way to make things a more inclusive environment was very rewarding in that sense.
And can you give me an example, for instance, of forms of microaggression that you face?
Yeah, so some of the microaggressions that I faced have included, I have been told in scientific spaces that I have attitude, even though normally I'm someone that is very respectful and does not raise my voice in any way or roll my eyes. So just microaggressions in that sense I have experienced.